Hello and welcome to Crazy Making. I'm Simon Adam, host of Crazy Making. In today's episode, the inaugural episode, I'm joined by two remarkable critical mental health scholars, Dr. Marina Morrow and doctoral candidate Efrat Gold. Marina is a professor at the School of Health Policy and Management in the Faculty of Health at York University. In her work, Marina uses critical mental health and intersectional approaches to better understand the social, political, and institutional processes through which health and mental health policies and practices are developed, and how social and health inequities are sustained or attenuated for different populations. Marina strongly supports public scholarship and the work and activism of the MAD movement and MAD scholars. She is the lead editor on a recent book called Critical Inquiries for Social Justice in Mental Health, available from the University of Toronto Press. Efrat Gold is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto engaging in MAD and disability studies. Through her writing and activism, she challenges dominant views of mental health and illness, moving towards contextualized and relational understandings of suffering and distress. Gold critiques psychiatry, focusing on those most vulnerable and marginalized by psychiatric power, discourse, and treatments. Her work is staunchly feminist, anti-racist, and anti-oppressive. Through explorations into norms, meaning-making, and constructions of legitimacy, Gold unsettles psychiatric hegemony by returning to the sites where psychiatric certainty has been produced. Wow. Okay. Welcome. Thanks for joining me today, Marina and Efrat.
Thanks, Simon. It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Marina, I want to start with you. I'm curious. Tell us, what are you up to these days? What sort of research are you currently conducting right now? What are you engaging in?
Well, that's a nice question to start with, Simon. So the work that I'm doing right now, I have a project that's funded, where we're actually looking at. Well, let me just start by saying it's a collaboration, quite a large project, a collaboration between colleagues who are working both in the university but also in community activist work on mental health. And it's a collaboration between Canada, Australia, and Kenya. And we've come together around our shared concerns about the way in which mental health care is often coercive, involuntary, in some cases extremely damaging to people. And so we want to explore some of this people's experiences in more depth of those practices. And the project itself has a number of different components, including, an analysis of policy, looking at people's lived experiences of these practices. And then we also very much want to bring forward services and supports and resources that are in line with human rights and in line with equity for people.
Wow, thanks, Marina. Obviously, really, really important work. You drew my attention to three concepts: coercion, involuntary, and damaging. And I'd like to return to these. I just kind of want to put them in your mind for now. I do want to get to Efrat, and I just want to just sort of understand what she's up to as well. And then I'd like to engage in a conversation about this idea of coercion, involuntary treatment, and damage related to psychiatric quote unquote care. So Efrat, let me turn to you. What are you up to? What's your research about?
Well, currently I'm in the process of writing my dissertation, so I'm pretty immersed in my research right now, which is archival research. Basically, going back to the archives, I've decided to return to the site where psychiatric certainty was produced in Canada. So basically where psychiatry began to carry the weight of medical fact. So how did this become a fact? what was the context, what were some of the things going on at that time. This is shortly following World War II. And I do that because I believe that by returning to the sites where, where certainty has been constructed and produced, and made to appear as fact or as legitimate, I believe that that really opens up productive conversation around, well, wait a minute, do we actually believe that? Did it hold then? Does it hold now? And what are some of the politics around that shape what we decades later come to understand as a fact?
I think you also call that legitimization or legitimation, I believe. Have you ever articulated it in that way?
I have. Yes, I think that we go through our day to day lives, and our lives are so shaped by institutions and by institutional definitions of things. And psychiatry and the concepts of mental health and mental illness are no different. They shape our day to day lives in so many ways, and some that we might be aware of, and others that we might not be aware of. And so my interest is in how did that legitimacy come about, and how was it created? Who was it created by, and to what ends?
All right, really, really important questions, Efrat. I just want, for reasons of clarification, um, you um, you say archives and archival research. For our listeners who are not familiar with what an archive is and what archival research involves, can you just explain a little bit around that?
Of course. Basically, archives are repositories of old documents, whatever they might be. So each archive might really vary quite a bit. My own research looks mostly at the archives of the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene, which today is known as the Canadian Mental Health Association. And through that, I also look at the McGill archives of how certain very influential departments of psychiatry came to exist. And also the University of Toronto archives, how these things are, and how a lot of these people were in conversation with one another. The construction of psychiatry as a field and also as a branch of medicine, it didn't just come about on its own. There's actually a key group of very influential people that brought this about. And they were working at McGill University, at the University of Toronto, and in the Mental Hygiene Institute and the National Committee for Mental Hygiene. So, and there's a lot of overlap between who those people are and what committees and programs they're working with. So a lot of the archives that I look at the meeting minutes from the meetings that were held, a lot of the correspondences between these people, as well as things like funding applications and grant applications, their efforts to get money, and how it is that they were presenting their desire to build up the field of psychiatry at the time when it was first being established as a branch of medicine.
Wow, very interesting sources of data that you're drawing on to create this obviously very important project, Efrat. Thank you for explaining the archive to us. I want to pose a question to you. If you were, given we're, critically engaging with mental health, obviously, and we're critically engaging with the concept of mental health and mental illness. And Marina kickstarted us really nicely. If I were to ask you, what is the biggest bone you have to pick with psychiatry? What is the biggest issue that you want in your work to tackle? Um, and I know, Marina, you mentioned coercion and involuntariness nature of psychiatry, and then this other thing that it's damaging. Um, how is psychiatry coercive and uh, creating sort of involuntary practices? And Marina, I'll start with you.
Great, thanks for that. I think, yeah, it's a really good question, and I think for me, and I know if you will expand on this more, but so one of the biggest bones I have to pick with psychiatry is partly that its legitimacy has not been well earned. So that when you look at the literature and you look at, say, for example, diagnoses that we now are becoming more and more familiar with in the public, things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, all of these different things that are sort of explained to us as though they are something that exists and that there's lots of good scientific evidence behind them. When you actually do a deep dive into the clinical literature, you discover that in fact it's a lot more messy and a lot more complex. Not that people don't experience distress on very high levels, but we don't really know enough about the brain and biology to say that these are legitimate kind of syndromes per se. And then, of course, the treatment in psychiatry for the last many decades, psychopharmaceutical drugs, many of which have very powerful and often damaging side effects. So that legitimacy piece is really important to me as well. And then in terms of your points about coercion and involuntary treatment, so psychiatry works in tandem with a legislative framework in the Canadian context and elsewhere, where the state has the power to take away a person's right to their own choices. And we don't do this in any other part of our healthcare system. We really only do it in the context of mental health. So if someone is seen to be, acting in a way that is socially unacceptable, that might be seen as possibly dangerous to themselves or others, they can immediately lose their rights and be taken in under the Mental Health Act, for example, in the Canadian context, and then detained and forcibly treated. And so, and because the treatments are sometimes worse, than the cure, that's where the problems come into play. So anyway, so those would be, I guess, some of the key issues that I would want to highlight around the problems with psychiatry. So not to say that all people's experiences of psychiatry are exactly the same, but there are many, many people who've documented the damaging effects of psychopharmaceutical treatment and these other kinds of practices, which include things like being secluded, being physically restrained, or being what is referred to as chemically restrained through these drugs.
Right. I was about to ask you, about there's the possibility of whole other segments of people who do report that they are helped by psychiatry, and you did actually you touched on that, Marina. Thanks very much. It's I guess the question is around all those other communities and populations who have emerged in resistance to the biomedicalization of mental health, who are our focus, who are the impetus of this great work that you and Efrat are doing. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
And I know, Marina, as a critical discourse analyst, which is what you are, you have definitely done a lot of work in examining the linguistic legitimacy of psychiatry. I'm curious, Efrat, if what, if anything, have you found in your research with the archives, if you're there yet? I'm not sure how far you are in your analysis with your dissertation, but the sort of legitimacy that you and Marina are talking about. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I think this actually also ties into what my biggest bone to pick with psychiatry is, which is that it's become the only option, the only way of understanding distress and suffering and crisis. And there are other ways. I think that, many people do feel that they have been harmed by the psychiatric system. And I'm no different. I too have lost a brother that I think really suffered at the hands of psychiatry and at the hands of understanding distress and difference only in one way that is very medicalized. So I think that that also speaks to legitimacy, because when you turn towards one option and one option only, it actually erases the fact that many ways to look at this exist and have existed throughout history, variously. And so in that sense too, it's less about whether or not people feel that they personally are helped by psychiatry, because some people do, and there's no denying that. But there is no other option, there is no other place to turn. And so I think, in terms of legitimacy, what I've found in the archives is a lot of this construction of distress, of difference, of any kind of deviation from norms, which require us to work in particular ways and to socialize in particular ways. Any kind of deviation from that then gets viewed and treated, whether a person wants it or not, only through a medical lens. So I think that's part of the problem with legitimization. And as Marina was saying, there's a lot that gets presented to us as there is no other way to look at this. This is a scientific fact. This is well established. When you look at the science, it's not actually as well established as it's presented as being. But even beyond science, there is only one way that is presented as any option of understanding human distress at all, and that's through psychiatry.
Thanks, Efrat. Yeah, that is really the crux of what I think what Michel Foucault would term a circulating truth, or a dominant subjugating discourse that pushes all others to the margin. Yeah, very interesting work. I want to ask you, Efrat, just really specifically related to your research. You did mention that what you're calling psychiatry carrying the weight of medical fact, or that sort of legitimization of psychiatry, and that happening shortly following World War II. Why then?
I think that following World War II, Western society especially was really in this period of flux. We had gone from this time of eugenics, where basically social conceptions of what a desirable citizen is became framed in medical terms, right? Where anybody disabled, anybody, Jewish people, certainly Black and Indigenous people in North America and in Canada, were framed as lesser than, for reasons that had more to do with social location than they did anything scientific. And so I think following World War II, there was a wide recognition that this was actually a very dangerous way to approach. But rather than excavating that period of human history and really looking at where do these things come from, where do these constructions of desirability, of social norms, how is it that we came to understand and frame them in terms of science and of medicine? uh, Instead of doing that, we actually just kind of shifted a little bit. So we can condemn that, killing Jewish people because they're Jewish, well, that's wrong. We can all agree. We shouldn't necessarily just be killing disabled people indiscriminately because their lives are less than, because they can't work and they can't contribute to society in the same way. But these concepts didn't just disappear. And I think many people believe that they did, that now we kind of look down on eugenics and as though this doesn't happen anymore. But it does. And these frames shifted to many different areas. I think a lot of them in areas of medical genetics. And certainly one of those areas is in psychiatry. And at the same time, you also have all of these traumatized people following World War II. You have refugees that have fled the Holocaust that are now, trying to set up their lives in different parts of the world, and learning new languages and trying to start families. You also have all of these traumatized veterans and soldiers that are returning from war. And so there really was an immediate need, I think, on a wide level to deal with that collective trauma in so many different ways. Now, unfortunately, trauma wasn't really a widely adopted concept or a widely considered concept at that time. And so the way that it kind of became constructed as an immediate outgrowth of eugenics is through this very medicalized vision of, well, if only we could take people and replace their problematic thoughts and personalities with more desirable ones, if only we could do that, then we would have this full society of happy, healthy model citizens that are contributing exactly as we want them to. So, in my work, this does actually relate quite a bit to ideas that were popular at the time around brainwashing and these conceptualizations that were even possible to just kind of replace somebody's personality with a whole different desirable one. And I think those are some of the reasons why, following World War II, this really did become much more established in a way that is quite similar to how we understand it today still.
And we see that really with every population that interacts with psychiatry. We see it with children um, whose behavior is pathologized. We see it with women who are first time mothers and framed as postpartum depressed and told that the world is a great place and a happy place and you should be joyous to have a child and kind of buck up and move on. And so it definitely infuses throughout various populations and communities throughout the world, this sort of ideology that you articulate, Efrat.
Absolutely. And I think it also, just to add one last thing, it
Yep.
it also shifts us and our attention away from the political, because the world is just fine as it is. What the problem is you as a person, as an individual, are unable to cope with it in various ways or to adjust to it the way that you are supposed to. So the problem is never political. It's always with you as an individual, as a medically ill person, as a mentally ill person.
Right. you know so you know so now we have psychiatry, and a number of us are not happy with mental health services. Psychiatry is at best problematic, at worst traumatizing, damaging. um, and as you say, Efrat, it's become the only answer, the dominant approach, the only approach in many instances and many social spaces, medical spaces, political spaces, and that there is no other option. This idea of no other option. But are there other options? Are there alternatives to psychiatry? Are there different ways of framing mental health, mental illness, psycho emotional distress and pain? Are there different ways of framing that and responding to that sort of distress that the everyday person would want to hear about, that is not psychiatry, that's beyond psychiatry? Um, are there other options, and what might they be? Efrat, do you want me to
Sure.
repeat?
Well, I think that what can't be overlooked here is that people do find ways to cope, and they find lots of ways to do that. So, some people might have been hearing a lot lately about microdosing and how that's helping certain people. For a lot of people, things like meditation, yoga, mindfulness practices help them in the day to day to stay grounded or to connect with themselves. Um, of course, there are, if for people who can afford it, there are more traditional therapies like talk therapy, even things like EMDR, which I've heard lots of things about, especially related to trauma. So I think that there are lots of approaches to distress and to suffering. I think often, almost always, in fact, those are not enough. Um, and to be honest, I also think that there is there's no way to take away distress from the human experience. I think that that is a defining part of what it is to be alive as a consciousness in the world. And I think that everybody, every individual, finds their ways and finds the approaches that work better for them to deal with their own distress.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's important, I think, to understand around alternatives is that our healthcare system is structured in such a way that it makes it very difficult to access anything that is not psychiatry based. So you probably have heard the term that the mental health care system is a two-tiered system, and what that means is that under our publicly funded healthcare system, all that's really funded is access to emergency care, crisis response, and basically kind of psychiatric care. People often talk about how difficult it is to access the system. Once you get access, you can sometimes then, avail yourself of some community-based supports. But it's not like there's a lot of things that people can just sort of walk into and get support and resources from. So there's already kind of a structural problem biased towards psychiatry. At the same time, we know there are a lot of alternatives out there, and I think as Efrat was saying, this can be a very individual thing in terms of what people find to be the most helpful and supportive to them during times of mental distress. But there are also well-researched alternatives, and I'm thinking, for example, of just something even locally here in Toronto, like the Gerstein Center, which is a crisis response center that's a non-medical approach that sends out people who've been trained to help folks in a crisis when they're experiencing mental distress, to try to avoid that cycle of going into the hospital, into emergency, and then immediately being psychiatrized. So that would be kind of one local example. There are other, international examples. I'm thinking of the Open Dialogue program, which I'm sure, Simon, you've heard of, and Efrat, you've probably heard of as well. That was established in Finland and was actually designed specifically to respond to people experiencing psychosis. And usually, if you're experiencing psychosis in Western medicine, immediately the treatment is psychopharmaceutical. In the case of the Open Dialogue program, it's really seen as something that has to be resolved through conversation and dialogue and relationship building with people who are around you and your support system. So a radically different way of understanding experiences of psychosis. So, there's many, many others that we could mention. There's the Hearing Voices movement as an example, which, normalizes the whole experience of hearing voices and does this again without using sort of psychiatric approaches or drug-based approaches. So I think there's many things out there, and I think what's frustrating is that they haven't been adopted on any kind of or supported, through policy or through financing in the mental health care system.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that, in terms of other options or alternatives, there's a sort of this push to, alternatives to reframe how mental health and mental illness is deployed medically. So to reframe it in more sort of community-based, phenomenological, lived experience type of human condition sort of framing. And then also alternatives to responding to people in this sort of distress. So it's sort of like two ways or two types of alternatives that obviously your work, Marina and Efrat, is importantly advancing. I want to touch on something, Marina. You said you've got with your current project, you are collaborating with people from Kenya and Australia, and I'm curious about that collaboration. I mean, why Kenya and Australia, and if you can talk about the importance of collaborating globally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Kenya, Australia, and Canada are all Commonwealth countries, and they've all had differing kinds of experiences of colonization. And so, in the context of Australia and Canada, it's the Indigenous populations that were colonized, and in Kenya, of course, it's the British colonization. And why this is important is that, and this is maybe not as well known to some folks, but that colonization and that history has actually also really shaped psychiatry and psychiatry's responses. So, for example, the ways in which Black folks and Indigenous folks have been more pathologized than the Euro-Canadian population would be one example. So those three countries were kind of chosen in part because of that, but also because they share a legislative framework around the Mental Health Act. So in terms of involuntary treatment, it's enacted, and the sort of the way the state enacts that is kind of similar in all three locales, even though the mental health care systems are quite different, especially in the Kenyan context. But the importance, I think, of collaboration, to sort of speak to that point. I mean, in my research, I've found it's critically important not just to have collaborations with other academics, but to have collaborations that involve people with lived experience, activists, advocates, policy decision makers, people working in the mental health care system, because I think the only way we can really further advance our knowledge and understanding of these issues and our approaches to them is through that kind of collaborative research. And it becomes even more powerful when you can do it across jurisdictions and in other cultural and global contexts. Western psychiatry has become the framework for the world, really. So if you think about the global health movement, if people have heard of that, the global health movement and global mental health movement has really been to bring Western psychiatric approaches to everyone. And, that's extremely problematic, because of the ways in which, for all of the reasons that we've talked about today, but also for the fact that it then overrides, traditional healing, knowledges that have been built up in other cultural contexts that are very powerful and helpful for people. So those kinds of collaborations, I think, are really critical, because it helps to bring, I guess, coherence to some of this, and also a way for us to resist this global movement of psychiatry being advanced and on all corners of the earth, so to speak.
Right, like a sort of resist the global movement by way of forging global connections of resistance. I see, and I do see that, so is it then? It's your hope that the findings that will emerge out of this research project will have an impact on not just Canadian discourse, but also Kenyan and Australian. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And I think the other thing, maybe just to mention on the global scale, is that all of these countries have signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights for People with Disabilities, which is a convention, an international convention, which really stands against the notion of people's choices being taken away in terms of, what kinds of care they receive, and really stands against, coercive practices. And so, that's another kind of, I think, key component of the research, but also just generally to keep in mind that some of the practices that we see as just kind of routine in the Canadian context are actually in violation of an international treaty that we've signed on to.
Thank you, Marina. Efrat, I want to skip over to you, and you might have already answered this or said something about it, but I'm curious, in your archival research, in your current doctoral study right now, are there any global threads, or is there any sort of relevance to this global health or global mental health movement that Marina mentioned?
That's an excellent question. And actually, there are, because some of the psychiatrists that were very, very instrumental in establishing the field of psychiatry in Canada were also some of the psychiatrists that were testifying at Nuremberg in the Nazi war criminal trials. And so we do see some crossover in that sense. There were projects in various parts of Africa that, in the archives, I realized, I only discovered this recently, were funded by the CIA. That is hard to kind of find what those studies actually entailed, but at the time they were calling it transcultural psychiatry. And this was an area that early psychiatrists were interested in building up. But I think even more broadly than just my own dissertation research, I can say that although a lot of the things that we've been speaking about today, they are based within the academy and within academia and that kind of discourse, But one of the things I absolutely love about this area is that it's really rooted in and led by community. So psychiatric survivor movements, mad movements, people, as Marina said, people with lived experience. That's really, this isn't just theory for the sake of theory. It stems from the real world and the need, and I think the constant demand from community to have different options and different ways of understanding themselves and their distress and how to cope with life. And so I think that that's actually um, infinitely important here, in the sense that this really isn't just an academic discipline. It's really rooted in people's experiences locally, globally, and in how these things interact.
Yeah, thanks, Efrat, for really actually bringing this down to the relevance to the everyday person, which is really my intention with the series of crazy making, is to really connect and engage with what I'm calling the everyday person, the general members of the public, because oftentimes we find that this sort of research and work, while it's very important, it tends to also be exclusive and exclusionary, confined to the hallways of the academy and the proverbial ivory tower. So that is I love how you really brought that down to relevance to everyday life. Before I let you go, I just want to kind of leave off with a final question for our listeners and for what I'm calling the everyday person. If you were to engage with your typical everyday member of the public, what would you tell them about psychiatry, the work that you're doing, the work that needs to be done? If you have any message or any advice to give, and I'll start with you, Marina.
I think my main message would be to people to move to encourage them to think beyond the individual, right? To think about how social context, how where you live, the access that you have to various resources, whether that's financial resources, whether that's educational resources, to think about how we're all embedded in a particular context, and that psychiatry unfortunately just doesn't really do a very good job of taking that context into account, and that it really looks at trying to fix the individual and the individual's brain, quite literally, rather than trying to understand the individual in this broader context. And that doesn't mean that the brain isn't important here. I think there's these really important interactions between biology and our environment, and that often isn't really taken into account. So I guess I would ask people to try to stretch their thinking, and to be suspicious of explanations that are very individualistic explanations that don't really help us to understand the broader context in which people experience mental distress, because that context influences everything from our experiences of the distress to the ways in which we'll be reacted to and supported or not supported within the current mental health care system.
Thank you, Marina, for reminding us that it is not just academics who purportedly engage in critical thinking and resistance, that anyone is capable of pushing, critiquing, uh, being suspicious, and sort of remaining vigilant. Efrat, what are your thoughts?
I think, jumping off of Marina's answer here, what I would ask people to think about is what happens when we come to interpret, human trauma and distress and suffering and crisis only through a medical lens. What gets lost there? And I think Marina really explained how context is one of the things that gets lost. So we depoliticize our understandings of ourselves and our traumas, the effects of living in an unjust world, and all of the isms that incorporates. But beyond that, also that we come to understand ourselves and our own distress and suffering through medical terms. And in doing so, we kind of start to take on the work of institutions and the work of enforcing normalcy for other people, and to in ourselves and as well in others. So whose reality and suffering ends up counting as real? And that would be my question, is when we turn towards the medical lens, what are we turning away from? What are the possibilities that we're not considering?
Yeah, thank you, Efrat, for helping us really relocate power and potentially seeing again the what I'm calling the everyday person as a site of resistance and someone who can possess the power to talk back and resist. I just want to thank you both immensely for your wisdom, your thoughts, your reflections, and for appearing on Crazy Making, this the inaugural episode of the series. Thank you, Marina and Efrat. Marina is a professor in the Faculty of Health at York University, and Efrat is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto. Thank you both.
Thank you, Simon.
Subscribe and listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Reach out to us by email at crazymaking@yorku.ca. That's crazymaking@yorku.ca. And follow us on Instagram at Crazy Making Podcast. Thanks for listening.